America was a much different place half a century ago, though for those of a certain age it doesn't seem that long. McDonald's sold burgers and shakes, but not breakfast. Payphones abounded everywhere in stores, shops, gasoline stations, hotel lobbies, and on street corners. Many of them still had rotary dials. So did the majority of telephones found in private homes, though push-button phones appeared in offices. There was no 911 service in most of the United States. One dialed 0 for the operator in emergencies, who connected the caller with the appropriate service. Operators also provided help in long-distance calling, such as collect calling, or charging the call to a third number. There were no video games, no personal entertainment devices, other than the transistor radio. Though portable tape decks were available, quality headphones were expensive. Music for entertainment was purchased on vinyl and cassette, 8-track and reel-to-reel tape. Americans didn't vape in 1970, but nearly half of adults smoked cigarettes, cigars and pipes. A non-smoking area in a business was rare, and neither did commercial aircraft prohibit smoking to certain areas. United Airlines introduced the non-smoking section on domestic flights in 1971. It was a much different world. Here is a brief look at American life 50 years ago in 1970. The presentation of sports on television changed in 1970. In 1970, the executives of three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, controlled what Americans watched on television. In communities, the three were affiliated with local stations, while other privately owned stations broadcast their own fare. Usually the non-affiliated broadcasts consisted of reruns and local celebrities, and usually they broadcasted in UHF. A television receiver not specially equipped could not process their signal. The three major networks broadcast, for the most part, in VHF. They determined what was available for Americans to watch, subject to the approval of the censors and the whims of sponsors. On September 21, 1970, ABC broke decades of tradition when it introduced NFL Monday Night Football on ABC. ABC changed the way football and later all professional sports was broadcast by creating an extravaganza featuring the personalities of the network's broadcasters. The inimitable Howard Cosell became a national celebrity from his connection to Monday Night Football, a love him or hate him figure. ABC had the only professional sports available on Monday nights in the fall, and the NFL obliged by attempting to schedule teams, which promised widespread fan interest. The government changed American television through legislation in 1970. The three networks made enormous profits from the fees they charged sponsors who advertised on their shows. In 1970, tobacco companies were major advertisers on all three networks. Cigarette advertisements were ubiquitous. A long-running advertising campaign for Marlboro created a character, which became a piece of Americana, the Marlboro Man. The ads featured a ruggedly handsome cowboy working the range, mending fences, herding cattle, and camping. When he relaxed, it was with a Marlboro cigarette. All the while the theme music, from the Magnificent Seven, played behind the narration. Other tobacco companies presented jingles and slogans which became part of the American lexicon. A drive to remove cigarette advertising from television began in the 1960s. The networks and the tobacco companies fought hard against congressional legislation targeting them. Tobacco companies were by far the largest advertisers collectively on television by 1970. On April 1, 1970, President Nixon himself, a pipe smoker, signed legislation passed by Congress known as the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act. It banned all cigarette advertising from television and radio, effective on January 1, 1971. Anti-smoking public service announcements continued to be broadcast. The Marlboro Man continued, though in print advertisements and on billboards and posters at points of sale. The Vietnam War was seen on television news nearly every day. Vietnam was the first televised war. Nightly newscasts and network specials presented images of American dead and wounded troops, body bags, bombed out or burned buildings. The images of the horrors of the war fed the protests in the United States. They too were broadcast, deepening the divide which separated the nation. Protests increased when Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos. Many of the largest protests over the war occurred on college campuses. One such protest was organized at Kent State University in Ohio upon news of Nixon's ordered raids into Cambodia by American bombers. Ohio Governor James Rhodes ordered the National Guard to the campus after 2 days of protests. Rhodes went to Kent and held a press conference, calling the protesters un-American. He added in a desk-pounding speech, They're the worst type of people that we harbor in America. The next day, after tear gas failed to disperse a crowd gathered for a scheduled protest, the National Guard opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding another 9, leaving 1 paralyzed. A presidential commission which investigated the shooting called it unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. Some justified the shooting and claimed the protesters were outside agitators, but all of the victims were registered students in good standing at Kent State University. Labor unions organized an attack on war protesters after Kent State. Anti-war activists organized a protest in New York, in the aftermath of the Kent State shootings, against both the president's war policy and the actions of the Ohio National Guard. A senior union official in New York, Peter Brennan, organized union members to counter-protest. On the morning of May 8, about 1,000 student protesters rallied at Federal Hall in New York, with a line of police separating them from the hall and from the public. Until late morning the rally was peaceful. Shortly before noon the rally was disrupted by more than 1,000 union protesters, who attacked both the students and the police. Students were beaten with signs and hard hats as the mob pushed toward City Hall. The flag above City Hall was at half-mast in honor of the students slain at Kent State. Union workers pushed through the building to the roof and raised the flag to full staff. Brennan claimed that the riot had been a spontaneous reaction of patriotic workers who had seen the American flag desecrated by protesting students. Several witnesses claimed the workers were led in an organized manner. In 1973, Brennan was appointed Secretary of Labor by Richard Nixon, and he was retained in that post after Gerald Ford ascended to the presidency. There were no deaths in what became known as the Hat Riot, but over 70 students and policemen were injured. The American auto industry developed small cars with better fuel efficiency. Throughout the 1960s, the Volkswagen Beetle became a common sight on American roads and in American driveways. Japanese automobiles, also small cars, began to arrive in increasing numbers in the United States late in the decade. America's so-called Big Four automakers, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and American Motors, developed models to compete with the Germans and the Japanese. AMC was the first to market in 1970 when they introduced the Gremlin. It was aptly presented to the American public on April Fool's Day. The Gremlin was basically half of an AMC Hornet. It was marketed as the first American import. Ford followed with the Pinto, and Chevrolet with the Vega, though they sold fairly well, especially when gasoline prices started to rise. All 3 vehicles were frequently the butt of jokes. Especially the Gremlin, which was called half of a car because that was, in essence, what it was. All 3 developed reputations for poor construction, fit and finish, and reliability. Years later the Pinto also developed the reputation of burning up. The American subcompacts damaged the reputation of American automakers, and did much to increase the sales of imports in the United States, which throughout the 70s offered superior quality and reliability. Apollo 13 revitalized American interest in the space program temporarily. Before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, Americans watched each manned space mission with avid interest. Apollo 12 repeated the feat, and with traveling to the moon evidently routine, public interest waned. Some in Congress wanted to end the program and save its costs. In April, Apollo 13, on the way to be the 3rd team of Americans on the moon, suffered a catastrophic explosion. Suddenly spaceflight was dramatic again, and for the next few days Americans, as well as the rest of the world, watched as the story unfolded. NASA engineers and astronauts came up with innovative solutions to each of the problems encountered to bring the astronauts home. News of the astronauts scrolled across Times Square's ribbon-board. Newspapers, Americans still read newspapers in 1970, carried dramatic headlines. The 3 networks covered every aspect of the dangers faced and the solutions achieved. It became a 4-day miniseries on television. The astronauts returned safely to Earth 4 days after the accident, and the American space program received a shot in the arm. The success brought national pride in the bravery of the astronauts and the ingenuity which brought them home. Tens of millions watched their recovery on television. By the time of Apollo 14's launch at the end of the following January, interest had waned once again. American movies reflected the divisiveness affecting the country in 1970. 1970 was a banner year for American films, driven in part by the development of multiplex theaters. More screens demanded more films. 1970 saw the release of Airport, which generated a number of sequels. 5 Easy Pieces cemented Jack Nicholson as a major star. Anti-war films such as MASH, Little Big Man, Joe and Suppose They Gave a War and Nobody Came all found supportive audiences. Another anti-war film, Catch-22, also debuted in 1970. The film Woodstock appeared, presenting the counterculture of the 60s and 70s in a positive light, at least to their fellows in the counterculture. Another war film, Tora Tora Tora, depicted the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor factually, while attempting to present the Japanese as more honorable than perfidious. But the big film of the year, which resonated with patriotic Americans and those who supported the Vietnam War, was Patton. The movie presented Patton as a dedicated and misunderstood warrior, glossing over the many foibles which made him problematic to his commanders. The film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It also won Best Actor for George Scott, but he refused the award, saying, "I don't want any part of it." 1970 saw the introduction of a new day of observance in America. April 22, 1970 was the first time Earth Day was observed in the United States. It has since grown to encompass over 190 countries, and is the largest secular holiday in the world. On April 22, 1970, 2,000 colleges and universities in the United States held events to recognize the environment and humanity's role in protecting it. Approximately 10,000 high schools and primary schools joined in, as did hundreds of cities, villages, and towns across the United States. Observances were held in New York, home of the 3 major television networks, and their activities thus found a national audience. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, more than 20 million people in the United States took part in the observances of the first Earth Day. President Nixon and his wife Pat observed the day by planting a tree on the White House lawn. The day came about as a result of increased awareness of litter, waste management, oil spills, pollution of American waterways, pollution of the air, and other environmental issues. American cartoonist Walt Kelly drew a banner for the first day, on which his character Pogo proclaimed once again, "We have met the enemy and he is us." The Beatles' breakup was revealed in the spring. On April 10, 1970, Paul McCartney released advance copies of his first solo album to journalists. That in itself was not a shock. The other Beatles had all released projects which were outside the group. But McCartney's album contained within a mock question-and-answer interview, which he had written, in which his departure from the Beatles was announced. They also made clear he had no plans to write songs with his longtime partner John Lennon for the then foreseeable future. Headlines around the world announced that Paul had broken up the Beatles. In truth, Lennon had announced his departure months earlier to the group, with the news kept private for reasons regarding contract negotiations. The announcement was nonetheless the effective end of the band, which had dominated the music industry in the 60s. Fans around the world mourned, and it became a common subject of debate in the United States over who was at fault for the breakup. Most of the blame in American eyes was directed at Yoko Ono. Others blamed it on Paul's wife Linda. Rumors that the Beatles would reunite after all their solo projects were completed stretched through the summer and autumn. On New Year's Eve 1970, McCartney filed suit in the High Court of Justice to dissolve the business partnership between the members of the Beatles. Rumors of a reunion continued up to Lennon's death in 1980 and beyond. Denver was awarded the 1976 Winter Olympic Games in May. On May 12, 1970, a group of Denver, Colorado civic leaders were feted in the city for having won the right to host the Winter Olympics in 1976. They prevailed in their bid over cities in Switzerland, Finland, and British Columbia in Canada. They were paraded through the city in a motorcade and delivered speeches chronicling the 16-year effort to win the Games. Detailed plans for the construction of the facilities to support the Games and the visiting athletes emerged over the ensuing weeks. As they did, the cheers faded away. Faced with the enormous costs, most of which were to be covered by Colorado taxpayers, factions emerged to oppose the Games being held in Denver. Denver planned for the Games to be held in a string of sites between the city and Steamboat Springs, a distance of about 170 miles. Environmentalists opposed the infrastructure which was needed, though the state offered to pay part of the costs, the bulk of which fell on the city of Denver. A grassroots movement against the Games gained traction through 1970 and all of the ensuing year. In 1972, voters rejected the Games with a majority of 59.4%. Having decided not to pay for the facilities, Colorado became the only entity to reject the Olympic Games, after having first been awarded them 2 years earlier. The 1976 Olympics were awarded to Innsbruck, which having hosted them earlier already had much of the necessary infrastructure in place. A new toy appeared in 1970 which launched its own industry. In the late 1960s, Parker Brothers rejected a game designed to allow modified football to be played indoors, but they were intrigued with the ball which was designed specifically for the game. It was a 4-inch ball constructed of polyurethane foam. In 1970, Parker Brothers released the ball as a toy, calling it the world's first official indoor ball. It was sold under the brand name Nerf. One of its early marketing slogans promised, "You can't damage lamps and windows. You can't hurt babies or old people." Televised advertisements for the ball were focused on Saturday morning hours, when children's programming dominated the airwaves. 4 million of the original designs sold in 1970 alone, and Parker Brothers aggressively expanded the use of Nerf in games and toys, including a Nerf basketball, football and baseball bats. Eventually Nerf bullets and darts were developed to be shot from spring-powered guns. Targets were included, as if the game designers really believed that children and adults weren't going to use the guns to shoot each other and unsuspecting pets. Nerf remains a thriving industry 50 years after its introduction as a simple ball, though Parker Brothers no longer makes it. After changing hands several times, Nerf became part of Hasbro in the early 21st century. The United States lowered the legal voting age to 18. During the protests against the draft over the course of the Vietnam War, leading complaint was that 18-year-old men could be drafted to serve in the military, but were denied the right to vote. In Congress, Senator Ted Kennedy and allies in the House raised the issue during debates over extension of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A provision was added which granted 18-year-old citizens the right to vote in federal, state, and local elections. Nixon allowed it as a political expediency to get the legislation passed, though he believed that the courts would find the provision unconstitutional. It gave the federal government control over state and local elections. Nixon was right in a case brought by his Attorney General John Mitchell. The Supreme Court found the provision unconstitutional, but it struck down only the section dealing with state and local elections. The right to vote in federal elections remained in force. The following year, the 26th Amendment was ratified, and the right to vote in all elections was granted those who had reached the age of 18. In the first presidential election, which followed in 1972, about half of the newly eligible voters participated. Voter turnout for the demographic declined in ensuing elections until the turn of the century. It consistently rose in national elections since. People carried their music with them to parks, the beach, and anywhere else. In 1970, the first of the music delivery devices, which became known colloquially as boom boxes, emerged. They were expensive, and they were loud. The former prevented them from becoming popular across the United States at first. Less expensive transistor radios and cassette players with larger speakers, and consequently superior sound, were available. They became popular. People playing Nerf outside, or washing their gremlins, could do so while listening to their music of choice. The tape cassette began to edge out the 8-track player as a preferred sound system in automobiles and home stereos. FM radio began to edge out AM as the preferred source of broadcast music. Cassette players often skipped or performed an act, which became known as eating the tape, when they were jostled while playing. The tendency made them unsuitable for use while jogging or even when walking. They sometimes exhibited the same tendency in cars, where they were often added as an aftermarket purchase, mounted in brackets under the dash or the driver's seat. It was a peril which caused the same tape to be purchased over and over in some cases. One popular album and tape which appeared in 1970 was Bridge Over Troubled Water, which became the best-selling album of the year, and which was the last studio album produced by the popular Simon and Garfunkel. American Top 40 was launched on the 4th of July, 1970. On July 4, Americans for the first time heard on their radios, "This is Casey Kasem in Hollywood," and in the next 3 hours, we'll count down the 40 most popular hits in the United States this week. American Top 40 was instantly popular, as Americans listened to the 3-hour broadcast, or at least parts of it each week. It kept them abreast of their favorite performers as well as new talent appearing on the airwaves. "Now on with the countdown" became a popular catchphrase. Kasem broadcast in segments between commercial breaks, giving background about the song, the performers, or both. The format expanded as time went on, and the program is still broadcast, albeit hosted by Ryan Seacrest. One song which topped the Billboard chart Before the debut of American Top 40 in 1970 was I Want You Back, by a group of brothers from Gary, Indiana who called themselves the Jackson 5. The group released 4 consecutive singles, which reached number 1 in 1970, the next 3 being ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. Marketing by Motown and aggressive media play created what was called by the press Jacksonmania during 1970. Other shows copied the format of American Top 40, and acts like the Jackson 5 frequently had several songs within the confines of the countdowns across America throughout 1970. Other types of music dominated at different times of the year. The biggest selling song during the summer months of 1970 was not from rock and roll, or hard rock, or R&B or Motown. It was a song called They Long to Be Close to You. Performed by the brother and sister duo The Carpenters, it remained at number 1 for 4 weeks. It was a year of musical diversity on the pop charts. Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head held the top spot for 4 consecutive weeks early in the year. Late in the year, a made-for-television band and family, The Partridge Family, held the top spot for 3 weeks and catapulted David Cassidy to fame. The song was I Think I Love You. 1970 was the last year the Beatles put newly recorded singles on the charts, though all 4 members would hit them individually. It was one of the last years that commercial radio concentrated on singles airplay. Within months, album-oriented rock emerged, and AM radio began to alter formats to all talk and all news rather than playing records. The superior sound carried by the FM signal in stereo killed the market for singles beginning in 1970, though the 45 single continued to be the focus of the recording industry to market bands for some years to come. Several beloved American fictional characters were born in 1970. The Mary Tyler Moore Show debuted in September 1970 and gave birth to several characters which became part of the American landscape. Among them were Mary herself. Others included her friends Rhoda Morgenstern and Phyllis Lindstrom. The almost impossibly obtuse Ted Knight was born from the show, as was Mary's boss, hard-drinking Lou Grant, who later gained a show of his own. So did Rhoda and Phyllis. The show and its characters remained popular 50 years later, both as nostalgia for some, and as newly introduced performers for a younger audience. Other enduring characters were born in other television programs during 1970. On January 5, 1970, the daytime serial known as a soap opera at the time, All My Children, debuted on American television. Actress Susan Lucey made her first appearance on the show on January 16, as the character Erica Kane. Lucey portrayed Kane for the next 41 years, until the show finally closed in September 2011. TV Guide called Erica Kane the most famous soap opera character in the history of daytime TV. Kane was the longest-running character in the history of American television played by a single performer. The character inspired at least 3 songs and 2 dolls manufactured by Mattel during the show's run. Railroads were rapidly fading from the American scene in 1970. Both freight and passenger traffic on America's railroads were perilously close to extinction in 1970. A series of government decisions had given significant advantages to shippers using other means, such as trucks and barges. Subsidies for highway construction had also made driving more feasible. Only a few large urban areas, such as New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia, had viable regional passenger trains. Intercity passenger traffic had dwindled to next to nothing. On June 21, 1970, the Penn Central, created as a merger of the once rivals Pennsylvania and New York Central, filed for bankruptcy. It was at the time the largest bankruptcy in American history. Congress responded with legislation, which created the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, NRPC. It operated under the name Railpax, before choosing to use the name Amtrak. Amtrak was controversial, with Democrats viewing it as subsidizing a failed industry. Republicans considered it nationalization of the American railroads. Most viewed it as a compromise to distract the public with the appearance of saving the passenger railroads. Nearly all would be surprised that it would survive 50 years, let alone operate profitably in some corridors, though by no means all. Several years later, another Congress created a similar solution for the ailing freight lines, merging them into Conrail. Handheld electronic calculators were a product of 1970. Before the advent of calculators, engineers, architects, designers, technicians, scientists, and mathematicians used slide rules to resolve difficult equations. In 1970, the first electronic handheld calculators appeared. Handheld was a bit of a misnomer. They were large, far too large to fit in a pocket, but they were portable. The first calculators were marketed by Bomer and Cannon and used chips from Texas Instruments. Another marketed by Bizicom used chips from Mostek. None of them could perform functions except add, subtract, multiply and divide. They were limited in the number of decimal places they could handle, and they had no screen on which to view the results. The calculators relied on thermal paper to deliver the results of its use to the user. Numbers were literally burned onto the paper, which was fed over a printer head. Thermal paper was sold separately, and was not known for being inexpensive. Batteries were rechargeable, and how long they could hold a charge depended on length of use, as well as ambient temperature. Most professionals regarded calculators as little more than a novelty, and continued to rely on their trusty slide rules. Within 2 years, calculators appeared which were smaller, more reliable, had screens as well as printers, and could perform trigonometric functions. The personal computer wasn't far behind. The entertainment dollar went further than in a later day. In 1971, could visit McDonald's and enjoy a hamburger, French fries and a shake for 89 cents. One needed another nickel if they wanted a cheeseburger. There were considerably fewer options on the chain's menu, and entering the restaurant was required. Drive-through windows weren't around yet for the most part, except at banks. A ticket to the movies was around $1.50, more or less. Minimum wage was $1.60. Gasoline was about 36 cents a gallon. It was pumped by a gas station attendant, who also washed the windshield, offered to check the oil, water, and tires, and often gave the purchaser gift stamps, complimentary drinking glasses, or other inducements. Gift stamps were common throughout the United States. An early version of customer reward programs, stamps were collected until books were filled, which were then traded for various gift items. The largest gift stamp organization was S&H Green Stamps, though there were several regional competitors, Top Value, Gold Bell, Greenbacks and others. Customers received stamps in accordance with the amount of money spent. Gas stations, grocery stores, discount stores, and department stores all offered gift stamps along with their goods and services, and in some larger towns and cities the stamp company had stores where the collected stamps could be redeemed for merchandise. Rain and snow didn't stop postal workers, but low wages did. Before 1970, the U.S. Post Office was a department of the federal government. Its workers were allowed to unionize, but not to engage in collective bargaining. By law, federal workers were not allowed to strike. In March 1970, postal workers did. The strike began in New York and spread to other cities across the country quickly. Over 200,000 postal workers stopped the flow of mail across the United States. The disruption of business was substantial in a time when email was non-existent. President Nixon gave a televised national address, in which he ordered the strikers to return to work. The result of his speech was more angry postal workers, and the strike expanded to nearly 700 post office locations and facilities. Nixon declared a national emergency on March 23 and ordered the National Guard to sort and deliver mail in New York and other major areas. The National Guard had no idea how to sort and deliver mail. The president then ordered what was called Operation Graphic Hand. Active duty military were ordered to take over mail delivery. Over 18,000 men of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines from military post offices were assigned. The strike was settled after 8 days when the postal employees returned to work. The U.S. Post Office was dissolved and the United States Postal Service was created, an independent organization of the executive branch of government.